Let's do a quick video about feeding in appropriate sized meals. So here we're looking at a blue beauty. So these guys are quite sweet. Just fed this female. So a couple things. We feed a lot of defrosted rodents here at Nerd versus a lot of live or pre-killed prey. A couple things to basically get people to realize. One thing that's really interesting about feeding frozen defrosted is the freezing process actually starts to break down the cellular, formation or whatever of the rodent. So basically, freezing destroys tissue, essentially. So if I freeze a rat and then I defrost it, you're already starting to break down some of that tissue. So you make the digestive process easier. Another thing to also consider is when I feed a fresh killed rat or a live rat, and this animal ingests it, they sometimes will they'll gas up more than they would if I just fed them a defrosted rodent. And that's because there's all sorts of different microbes in the gut of that rat, and then it's being ingested by the snake. And what that does is it causes the animal to gas up. And sometimes after you feed it, within a couple of days, this little, you can see you can see how this rat is bulging it out. That within 2 or 3 days will really start to inflate, and that actually can be very taxing on this animal in the sense that this animal's digesting. There's a whole bunch of physiological change that's going on within this animal as it's breaking down this large meal. Without going into all the details, it can also be very taxing. It actually requires a fair bit of energy from this animal. You want to make sure your animals are really well hydrated, so they have a clean source of water. That's critical. So after you feed your snake, you always want to make sure there's clean, fresh water. And animals really do appreciate clean water. And that's going to make the whole process of digestion a little bit easier on the animal. You also want to watch things about the heat. If I take an animal like this and I feed it, within a day or two, as the animal starts digesting, their core body temperature without auxiliary heat is going to start rising. So if I have an animal that's digesting versus an animal that's not digesting, the animal that's digesting is definitely going to be a few degrees warmer, just because the whole process of the metabolism and basically just digestion is going to cause heat, because there's all these calories that are being involved with the digestion of that meal. So let's say if we look at a couple blood pythons. So this animal right here, she's just had a defrosted meal. So what she's doing is she actually has a kind of a small water dish, and she's already going to that water dish and wants to start cooling herself down. Blood pythons are they're very leery about too high heat, and if you get them too hot, they become almost frantic, and they become very persnickety. How about that? So this animal, after she's just fed, she's already starting to put herself in the water dish, and she's going to start doing this to kind of cool herself down. So if I'm reading the signs here, I'm actually going to want to include a larger water dish and just kind of leave her alone. But you can see her midsection, so it's just distended. So I'm not giving her a giant, huge meal. As soon as I start giving a giant meal, it's a little bit harder on this animal. And what this animal's going to look like in about 2 days, she's going to swell up a little bit. So let's say I look at this one. Here's another blood python, also just ate today. Not too big, smaller, frequent feedings are healthy. Here's a nice sized water dish. So this animal, if she so chooses, she can go and locate herself in this dish and she'll start cooling herself down. Right now she just ate today, and so her temperature is, she's very comfortable. So these are a couple things you really want to consider when you're feeding animals. So just because your animal can eat, it doesn't mean you always want to do that. So when you basically are sizing your food item, you really want it so it makes a nice little bulge, not just this dramatic, giant, huge bulge, because even though the animal can eat it, the next couple days in the snake's life can be kind of hard on it. And if you don't have your temperatures totally dialed in, and if it's too cold in the room, if the food item actually starts to rot, so this animal cannot find the proper temperature where its metabolism is kicked in and it can process that meal, you can start actually putting this animal in peril. And that means that the animal's fed on something, and now it's starting to digest. So within a couple days, it needs to be just at the right temperatures that it can thermoregulate finds heat when it needs it and gets away from heat when it doesn't need it. So if you get it too cold or too hot, both those things can basically impair the digestive process. And what will happen is if it's too cool, the food item actually starts to rot inside the animal, and that is really bad because actually that can actually kill the animal. Sometimes the animal will regurgitate that meal, other times it doesn't regurgitate the meal, and you get like a really nasty, sometimes a scenario after where they actually regurgitate eventually, and there's fat all over the cage, and that's basically pancreatitis, and that's really taxing on the animal. So you want to make sure you have your temperatures dialed in, and smaller frequent feedings versus huge bolus items are definitely easier on your animal. And if you obviously you love your animal, you don't want to like just feed your animal and like do something stupidly where you can basically put the animal in peril or in a bad place. So always make sure, you know, especially when you're feeding things like larger pythons, like reticulated pythons, Burmese pythons, and boas, sometimes you actually want to give them even a few water dishes because they'll easily drink a full bowl of water as they're digesting, you know, their meals. And a lot of times they'll drink it and then they want to have more, but we don't give them more, and it makes it a little bit tough on these guys. So I know this was just kind of randomness about these snakes, but a lot of times people don't really consider these things. Certainly, you know, people when we're keeping emerald tree boas and green tree pythons and different arboreal animals that are sensitive when they're laying on a perch, once they eat a big meal, it really can be a little taxing. So if I look at something like this, oops. So that animal has just fed. So that emerald tree boa in a day or two, the one on the left, will swell up a little bit, and she's going to potentially get a little uncomfortable, whereas an animal like this hasn't. So if I were to feed this animal, I would want to make sure it's just going to give a little bit of a bulge. But this is an emerald tree boa, so emerald tree boas are definitely, you know, not always the norm. But you want to take some thought in what you're feeding. Right? All right, I guess we'll say goodbye to one of my nonsense videos about feeding. Say goodbye.